So what we're going to talk about today is watercolor and digital techniques. Introduction to watercolor. This is generally for people who are beginning in watercolor, who have never touched watercolor in their lives before, or perhaps people who have maybe done a little bit of watercolor but just don't understand how the medium works. Some of the topics covered will be the introduction to watercolor in more depth, how to handle watercolor, watercolor techniques, digital techniques, and the conclusion. Introduction to watercolor and the history of it. Watercolor has started as early as the Paleolithic era, and back then watercolor was not pre-made, so watercolor had to be made and mixed and all that other good stuff. And gum arabic was also used with watercolor back then. It probably still is now, just maybe not as often. And some earlier watercolors are known as cave paintings because obviously they didn't have paper back then, so they had to do it on something. Watercolor today. Watercolor could be bought pre-made, unlike back then, because we didn't have stores and industrial things. And you can use paper instead of caves. I mean, if you want to draw it on caves and stuff, then that's good too, but you can use paper now. And resources are not as limited, especially when it comes to light. Back then, they did not have electricity. If you're still working on watercolor and it gets dark out, you can turn on the light. Watercolor is a medium. Watercolor is not like other paint medias like oil and acrylic. It's more freely. You put some watercolor in a paper, you let it do its thing, you leave it alone, you go move on something else on that watercolor page. And then come back to it later on so that it doesn't create a flatness to it. And handling watercolor. Watercolor cannot be handled the way oil or acrylics is handled. You put a little bit of water on the brush, you put a little bit on the paper, and you just leave it alone and continue and move on to another part of it and then come back to it and add more layers to it. Unlike acrylic and oil, watercolor cannot be layer on layer on layer. Not all at once anyways. And then certain materials, you use paper towels for lifting. You can use different brushes like round brushes, angular brushes, bigger brushes. Bigger brushes you more likely use if you want a bigger wash. You only need about like 12 colors in your palette. The rest of the colors you're going to make are through color mixing. Handling watercolor paper types. There are 3 paper types. There's hot press, cold press, and rough. Rough is more commonly used. When you need to lift something, and you know you're probably more likely going to have to lift some watercolor up, you probably want to use rough. You do not want to use hot press because that is very difficult to lift watercolor with. Handling watercolor. Watercolor is a medium. Again, medium is not like oil and acrylic. You want to let it move freely. If colors mix, it's not a big deal. It actually may even enhance the paper. Well, the art piece. Color schemes with watercolor. Depending on how dark or light you want the color to be, depends on how much water you use and pigment. If you use more water and less pigment, it's going to be lighter on the paper. If you use more pigment and less water, it's going to be darker on the paper. Watercolor techniques. You can use straws, rice, salt. Straws are used to make maybe interesting like backgrounds. You want to blow the watercolor out to make not so straight lines or straight lines at the same time. Like in this image of the fish to create the fish of the tail. The tail of the fish. Rice you want to place on the watercolor when it is wet and then let it dry, and then you want to take it off of something like a gift card or a credit card or something that you don't use anymore. And you want to do that with salt as well. With glue, you use glue to help enhance lines so the lines pop out more after you paint on top of the glue, which you want to wait until the glue is dry, otherwise that's just going to be a big mess. Alcohol, you just want to put a little bit on in certain areas of the watercolor you want to put on, and it's going to make little like cells and splattering of kind of cells. Saran wrap you want to put on while the watercolor is still wet, and leave that on while it's drying. And then once it is drying, you can take it off, and it leaves little lines or creases where the crease of the saran wrap was to create an interesting effect for the watercolor. Now, digital techniques. Mostly you're going to use Photoshop. You can probably use other Adobe products like Illustrator or InDesign, but usually you're going to use Photoshop. You can use everyday things to put as like backgrounds or to create something and then print it out to make onto a watercolor piece, or you can use it as a background, layer mask it if you already have a file made already, and then print it out and then watercolor on top of that. Or if you found an everyday object that you find interesting that you want to incorporate into your watercolor piece, you can pen tool it, cut it out, and then place it wherever you want to place it. Now, the digital techniques, what I call a watercolor sandwich, basically you're doing watercolor on top of digital, back on top of watercolor. Basically what that means is you're going to make a watercolor background, slide it under well, scan it and then slide it underneath a Photoshop file that you already have prepared for that. And then you want to layer mask off the background on the Photoshop file where you do not want the watercolor to show. And then you're going to print it out, which you want to make sure the orientation is correct so that it prints out correctly and on the right size paper, and make sure that the paper quality is normal. And then once that's done, you're going to let the ink dry for like 15 to 20 minutes, and then you'll be able to watercolor back on top of that, which will create a watercolor sandwich. In conclusion, watercolor can be very frustrating, but if you use the general techniques given and you just keep practicing and experiment with it and have fun with it, then it'll get better and it'll become more successful and more enjoyment. Credits to the template that I used to make this presentation and images from Google. These images are not mine. I got them from Google.